The Mission District is now a hotbed of deadly rivalries between MS-13 and the Surenos on one side and the Norteños on the other. But how did this iconic San Francisco neighborhood become ground zero for one of the fiercest gang wars in California? Let's take a closer look at the violent war that has shaped and shaken the Mission District for decades. The Mission District, often called simply the Mission, is one of San Francisco's most historic neighborhoods. It got its name from Mission San Francisco de Aces, a church built way back in 1776 by the Spanish, making it one of the oldest parts of the city. The Mission has long been a cornerstone of San Francisco's Latino community, particularly for Mexican Americans. Located in the east central part of the city, the Mission is bordered to the east by a major highway, which separates the inner Mission from Potrero Hill. It's an area full of vibrant life, but also a neighborhood that has faced its share of challenges. Between the 1940s and 1960s, a wave of Mexican immigrants made the Mission their home after being displaced from other areas in the city. As the Mexican population grew, many white residents moved out, solidifying the Mission as a hub for Latino culture. By the 1960s, the neighborhood welcomed more newcomers, this time from Central America. These new arrivals brought their own cultures, traditions, and flavors, making the Mission even more diverse. However, this period also marked the beginning of a darker chapter for the neighborhood. Crime began to rise, and gang violence became a major issue. The Mission saw frequent clashes between gangs that fought for control of the area, starting with the MS-13, or Mara Salvatrucha, one of the most feared gangs in the world. But its story starts in a way that might surprise you. Back in the 1980s, Los Angeles was flooded with immigrants from El Salvador fleeing a brutal civil war. For many of these Salvadorans, life was tough. They were strangers in a foreign land, trying to survive in neighborhoods already controlled by gangs. To protect themselves from those gangs, they formed their own group. What started as a form of defense eventually spiraled into something much darker. When the Salvadoran Civil War ended in 1992, something unexpected happened. Many of these MS-13 members were arrested in the US and deported back to Central America. But instead of putting an end to the gang, this deportation only helped it grow. The violence, the fear, it all spread like wildfire. Before long, MS-13 wasn't just a local problem in Los Angeles, it was a regional nightmare. What's especially tragic is that Central Americans themselves are the main victims of MS-13's violence. And it's not just adults, it's kids. Many of the gang's victims and even its members are shockingly young. In El Salvador, children are often forced to join the gang, sometimes while they're just walking home from school or even while attending church. Imagine being a kid with no real choice, pulled into a world of violence you never asked for. MS-13 is infamous for its brutality. Initiation rituals can involve being beaten for 13 seconds or, in some cases, murdering to prove loyalty. Most of the members are young men, often struggling with poverty and homelessness. They survive by selling substances in small quantities, stealing, and extorting money. They live in abandoned buildings called destroyers, which they use as hideouts for meetings, parties, and substance deals. One of the most recognizable things about MS-13 has always been their tattoos. Members are often covered in ink on their bodies, their hands, even their faces. You'd see markings like MS, Salvatrucha, devil horns, or the name of their specific clique. But around 2007, they started ditching the face tattoos. Why? To avoid standing out when committing crimes. And speaking of cliques, MS-13 is made up of these smaller, independent groups that operate like mini-teams. Each clique has its own turf and handles its operations. But here's the scary part. In places like Los Angeles, Dallas, and Atlanta, law enforcement is noticing these cliques working together more often, making the gang even more dangerous. But just when you thought it couldn't get darker, enter the Surenos, a brotherhood with a brutal twist. The Surenos are a collection of gangs that operate like a massive network, all pledging their loyalty to the Mexican mafia. It's almost like a twisted brotherhood, especially in prison. Outside, they might fight each other, but once they're behind bars, they stick together. It's a strange but effective system, and over the years, they've spread everywhere in the US, becoming a serious force to reckon with. Their roots are in Southern California, but they've expanded far beyond that. You'll find them all over the Southwest, in California, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, and Utah. They've even made their way to places like Illinois, Oklahoma, and up into the Pacific Northwest. Shockingly, they've even been discovered in the U.S. military, and they maintain strong ties to drug cartels in Mexico. Their influence reaches nearly every corner of the country now. The name Sur means south in Spanish, but for the Surenos, it also stands for Southern United Raza, or Southern United Race. Their loyalty to the Mexican mafia is symbolized by the number 13, the 13th letter of the alphabet, M. Becoming a Sureno isn't easy, it has to be earned. Most of the members are of Mexican descent, but they also include people from other backgrounds. They have a distinct style too. They're big on sports gear, repping teams like the Dodgers, Rams, and sometimes the Lakers. Up north, it's more about the Cowboys, Sharks, and Raiders. Their clothing is a part of their identity, and it's often used to show their allegiance. The Surenos are deeply involved in crime. They're involved in everything from murder and drug dealing to kidnapping and extortion. A lot of their income comes from selling substances and working directly with major Mexican cartels. They run their operations like a business, but they're ruthless when it comes to protecting their territory or profits. Law enforcement has its hands full with the Surenos. One of the biggest challenges is that they don't operate under a single leader. Instead, they function as a network of smaller groups that work together when needed. Over the years, the government has made some progress with major arrests and drug seizures, but the Surenos remain a constant problem. Their violent rivalries with other gangs only add to the chaos, leading to frequent clashes and escalating violence. In places like the Mission District in San Francisco, the Surenos are strong, and they clash constantly with their longtime enemies, the Nortenos. Now, the Nortenos are one of the biggest gangs out there, but they're completely different from the Surenos. Their allegiance lies with Nuestra Familia, another powerful prison-based group. While the Surenos dominate Southern California, the Nortenos claim Northern California as their territory. And their biggest rivals, the Surenos. The rivalry traces back to Nuestra Familia and the Mexican Mafia, or La M, which backs the Surenos. La M was originally created to protect Mexican prisoners, but at one point, members started abusing inmates from Northern California. The tension exploded over something as small as a pair of shoes. One La M member stole them from a northern inmate, and that single act caused a gang war that's still raging today. It's wild how something so minor turned into such a massive and ongoing conflict. The Nortenos are loyal to Nuestra Familia and proudly represent the number 14, which stands for the 14th letter of the alphabet, N. Their signature color is red, and many of them wear tattoos with 4 dots to symbolize their allegiance. They even have their own ways of communicating, a special whistle or chirp, almost like a bird call, to signal one another. If you hear someone shout, "Shau," it's a Norteno staking their claim to their turf. And when it comes to their rivals, they don't hold back, calling Surenos names like Scraps or Surrats to show their disdain. And then the rivalry turned deadly fast. It was 2 a.m. on June 16, 2003, and 4 friends, Wilfred, Marie, Harold, and Mark, were hanging out at the BART station. They had been drinking, and some had even smoked some stuff. Out of nowhere, a dark blue Lincoln drove by, slow and low. It came back around, and the guy in the passenger seat leaned out shouting, "Where you from?" Then gunfire erupted. 4 to 6 shots. Mark was hit twice, leaving him paralyzed. Wilfred said there were 3 people in the car. At the same time, Rachel Butler was driving to a 7-Eleven with her friends, Brandy and Deshawn. They parked near a blue Lincoln where Michael Perez sat in the passenger seat. Deshawn got out to go into the store. While waiting, Rachel noticed another guy, Michael Rojas, standing on the sidewalk. A black Mustang then pulled up, and a big man, later identified as Alfred Duenas, got out and walked into the store. Meanwhile, a woman named Angelique Silvera came out of the 7-Eleven, hopped into the Lincoln for a moment, then went back inside. Rachel stayed in her car while watching all of this unfold. Rojas walked over to the Lincoln and spoke to Perez, who was still in the passenger seat. Perez asked, "Are you ready to do this?" Then Perez started putting on black gloves and pulled up a bandana over his face. Rojas walked over to the driver's side and Silveira returned to the back seat. When Duenas came out of the store, Perez asked him something about the Nortenos. Duenas, clearly agitated, said, What is it?" like he was ready to fight. He started walking back toward his car. Perez suddenly jumped out of the Lincoln and Rachel saw a gun in his hand. She panicked, started her car, and Deshawn ran back inside. Before they could leave, Rachel saw Perez raise his gun and fire at Duenas. Duenas collapsed and died right there. In a panic, Rachel sped away, but at the next stoplight, she saw the blue Lincoln again. Perez was still in the passenger seat and Rojas was driving. Terrified, Rachel decided to go back to the 7-Eleven. She hoped there might be security cameras to prove she had nothing to do with what happened. After dropping Deshawn off, she went back to the scene with her friend Taylor to report everything to the police. The next day, police found the blue Lincoln. Silveira was driving, and Perez was still in the passenger seat. Perez even gave the police a fake name. During their search, officers found substances, gloves, a sweatshirt, and a gun. Both Perez and Silveira tested positive for gunshot residue. A few days later, police showed Rachel photo lineups. In the first set, she identified Rojas as one of the shooters. In the second, she pointed out Perez as the man who pulled the trigger. However, she couldn't identify the woman in the car. Rachel also admitted to having a prior conviction for substance possession, which the police noted. A forensic expert named John Sanchez analyzed the bullets from both the BART and 7-Eleven shootings. He confirmed that they all came from the same gun. Then came Silveira's testimony. Granted immunity, she revealed everything. She said she met Perez in 2002 while dating a Norteño, but eventually started seeing Perez, who was a Sureno. She also met Rojas through him. In May 2003, Perez bought the blue Lincoln but registered it in his brother's name because he didn't drive. Silveira usually drove it, and Perez kept a gun hidden in the back. On June 14th, 2 days before the shootings, Silveira and Perez had a big argument. She left and met her ex, Bolanos, and his friend, Duenas. Later that night, she went back to Perez. The next day, they used substances together and picked up Rojas. While driving around, Perez suddenly opened the car door and started shooting at someone on the street. Silveira saw the victim fall and yelled at Perez, "Why the hell did you do that?" Later, they stopped at a 7-Eleven. Silveira went inside while Perez stayed in the car. Duenas showed up and they exchanged words. Duenas accused Silveira of choosing scraps, a derogatory term for Surenos, over Bolanos. Silveira tried to calm him down before heading back to the Lincoln. When Perez asked who she had been talking to, she mentioned Duenas. That's when she saw Perez putting on a blue bandana. When Duenas came out of the store, Perez asked him, "Where are you from?" Duenas responded, "Norte controla," meaning the Nortenos controlled the area. Duenas ran toward his car, but Perez followed, gun in hand. Silveira thought Perez was going to rob him. Then, gunfire erupted. About 4 shots. Perez and Rojas jumped back into the Lincoln and they drove off. Afterward, Silveira was placed in the Witness Protection Program. She testified that Perez was the father of her daughter and that they still kept in touch. As for Perez, he was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the shootings. Fast forward a year, and the violence only escalates. This time, it's deeply personal. It's June 26, 2004, around 8 p.m. Fuentes is out walking with his 6-year-old son, Rafael. They're heading to a store near 24th and Hampshire in the Mission District, a neighborhood that's deep in Norteño territory. Now, Fuentes wasn't just any guy. He was the leader of MS-13, a Sureno gang. And remember, the Surenos and Norteños are sworn enemies. As Fuentes and Rafael cross the street, something terrible happens. Fuentes is shot and killed. His body is found lying face down with gunshot wounds, wearing bright blue shoes, an unmistakable Sureno color. The police quickly suspect Campos, a known Norteño gang member, as the shooter. Rafael ran home crying, telling his mom that a man pulled out a gun and shot his dad. He said his dad wasn't holding any weapons. There was another witness that night, a woman named Denny. She was parked nearby when she heard a gunshot. Turning around, she saw 2 men standing just a foot apart. One had a gun, and he fired at the other man. It was over in seconds. No fight, no warning, just shooting. The shooter then ran off, hiding the gun in a planter as he fled. Denny followed him in her car and watched as he ducked into a laundromat. The police arrested Campos there shortly after. Denny later identified Campos as the shooter, and another witness confirmed seeing Campos running from the scene. When the police searched the planter, they found a .38 caliber revolver with all 6 bullets fired. Gunshot residue was also found on Campos's right hand. The autopsy revealed Fuentes had been shot multiple times, once in the cheek, twice in the back of the head, and 3 times in the back. The shots were fired from a few feet away, and there was no gunpowder or soot on Fuentes' hands, meaning he hadn't fired a gun. As the investigation continued, it became clear this wasn't just a random shooting. Both Fuentes and Campos had deep ties to rival gangs. Fuentes, known as Memo, was a prominent MS-13 member, with tattoos marking his allegiance. Campos, meanwhile, was a leader in the Norteño gang. Campos claimed he was living in fear of MS-13. He said they had tried to kill him multiple times in the months leading up to the shooting. One time, he was walking with his ex-girlfriend when someone from MS-13 opened fire, injuring her. Another time, Campos was chased by a blue Honda through Sureno territory. Fuentes was in the passenger seat, and someone in the car started shooting at him. The scariest incident happened on June 9th. Campos was at a pizzeria with his girlfriend when an SUV pulled up. The passenger got out, pointed a gun at Campos, and it was Fuentes. Campos said he was terrified and started carrying a gun for protection after that. On the night of June 26th, Campos was walking to get more tattoos. He wasn't wearing gang colors and wasn't looking for trouble, but he had his gun on him. Then he saw Fuentes with his son. Fuentes let go of Rafael's hand and started walking toward Campos. Campos claimed he panicked. He thought Fuentes was reaching for a weapon, so he pulled out his gun and shot first. Campos insisted he acted out of fear, not to gain respect in the gang. In the end, Campos was convicted of murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. 4 years after Fuentes, another devastating shooting would rock the Mission District. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, June 22nd, 2008, when tragedy struck the Bologna family. They were driving down Congdon Street in San Francisco, Andrew Bologna, his dad, and his brothers, just going about their day. Everything seemed normal until they came to a stop sign. Out of nowhere, a Chrysler 300 pulled up, its windows tinted so dark you couldn't see inside. It turned and blocked their way. Andrew's dad tried to back up to give the Chrysler room, but instead of passing, the car pulled up just a foot away, way too close for comfort. Then things took a terrifying turn. Andrew watched in horror as shots were fired. He saw his dad get shot, ducked down, and heard more shots ring out. Their car lurched forward and crashed into a parked car. When it all stopped, Andrew climbed out and saw the Chrysler speeding away, but the damage was done. His dad and brother Michael were already gone. His other brother Matthew died 2 days later in the hospital. Andrew later described the shooter as a Latino man in his 20s or 30s with black hair and a mustache. He told the police he only caught a quick glimpse, but was confident he could identify the person. Other witnesses came forward too. 2 people nearby heard the gunfire and saw the Chrysler speeding off. One even spotted 2 people inside the car and said the driver was Latino. Another witness said they saw 2 men in white shirts in the front seats and someone in the back. The driver's window was partially open. Officer Campos was one of the first responders to the scene. Andrew told him the driver had been glaring at them before the shooting. 2 days later, the police connected Edwin Ramos to a Chrysler 300. They showed Andrew a photo of Ramos, and Andrew immediately identified him as the shooter. That same night, the police searched Ramos's house and arrested him. When Ramos was questioned, it all started with denials. He claimed he had nothing to do with the shooting, but under pressure, his story shifted. He admitted to driving the Chrysler, but insisted he didn't fire the gun. He said someone else, Wilfredo Reyes, was the shooter. Ramos claimed he had been too scared to tell the truth earlier because Reyes had threatened his family. Ramos's version of events painted a chaotic picture. He said earlier that day, 2 of his friends, Marvin Medina and Morris Flores, had been shot. Reyes called him and told him to pick him up. Ramos said he didn't know why Reyes wanted a ride but drove him to the Mission District anyway. That's when things spiraled out of control. According to Ramos, as they were driving onto the freeway, Reyes suddenly accused the Bolognas of being Norteños. Then, without warning, Reyes reached across Ramos, rolled down the window, and started shooting at the Bologna's car. Ramos claimed he didn't see it coming and just drove away in panic. When the police pressed him further, Ramos refused to enter protective custody, saying he couldn't be around Nortenos because he was a Sureno gang member. He admitted to being part of the 20th Sureno gang and confessed that his gang ties made his life even more complicated. The investigation kept digging deeper into the gang connections. Marvin Medina, who had been shot earlier that day, testified in court. He denied knowing Ramos or being involved with the MS-13 gang, but the prosecutors had evidence to suggest otherwise. Text messages between Medina and Ramos tied them together. Eventually, Medina opened up about his life in the gang. He said he'd been involved in robberies, hunting enemies, and even shooting someone to prove himself. He also explained the gang's rules, like always telling the driver, "If you're carrying a gun." Medina claimed he called Ramos after being shot and later heard about the Bologna murders from Ramos himself. Medina pled guilty to perjury and was sentenced to probation. But even with his credibility in question, Medina identified Reyes as the shooter. By May 2012, a jury found Edwin Ramos guilty of murdering the Bolognas and attempting to kill the other family member. The following month, the judge handed him a sentence of 183 years to life in prison. It was clear Ramos would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Ramos appealed his conviction, arguing that the trial was unfair because of evidence related to his gang ties and statements he made to the police. While the court reviewed some parts of his sentence, most of the original decision stood. As for Wilfredo Reyes, he was arrested in North Carolina and brought back to California in 2012. At first, he pleaded not guilty, but in 2015, he changed his plea and admitted to being in a gang and firing at the Bologna's car. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison as part of a deal. The Mission District has changed a lot. Gangs and violence still exist, but they've declined as police crack down on gang activity. Gentrification and rising rent prices are reshaping the neighborhood, and the Latino population is shrinking. By 2025, it's expected that far fewer Hispanic and Latino families will live in the area. Even as the community evolves, the Mission will always be remembered for its resilience and strong community spirit. Appreciate you watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe for more.